Okay, good morning everyone. I've got about half an hour, but I might be slightly less than that to talk about the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative. It's been mentioned in dispatches already under the acronym SISI. So for those that are unfamiliar, if you hear me talking about SISI, it's this project. It's also been mentioned that I work for Nature Scot. Nature Scot is the artist formerly known as Scottish Natural Heritage, or SNH. So for anyone who is a bit muddled and trying to keep up with our nimble name changes, that's who we are and what we were. So without further ado though, I'm going to bash on and tell you about the project and our approach to mink control and how it's going basically. So the SISI project is a 4-year scheme, 2017 to 2021. So we in theory are due to end this October, but we are expecting to be extended to October 2022. And we're working across a pretty large area of Scotland, so 29,500 kilometres squared of mainland Scotland. It's about a third of the landmass of Scotland. And we're working clearly with a big area, but working with community-based partners and volunteers to try and make invasive species management happen, both on the ground, but at a scale which can be effective. And we clearly, to do that, need to engage with lots of different people as to how they connect with their own local environments and actually collaborate and contribute to a bigger effort, if you like. Inevitably, there are partners, there are always partners, there always should be partners, and my job is to try and herd these cats together and make the effort effective. The major funder of the scheme is the National Lottery Heritage Fund, 1.59 million, Nature Scot with 500,000, and importantly in-kind support of 1.25 million. So we have a number of different fishery trust and rivers trust partners, and obviously funding partners too, and my job is to coordinate both the finance and the delivery. And our key academic partners as well, the University of Aberdeen, who are particularly important actually in the mink control work that we're doing. Next slide, slide 4. And there's 3 different elements to the SISI project. One is the mink control, which I'm going to cover further. Invasive plant control, which we're working on that same landscape scale control schemes, and education awareness that Vicky is going to speak about later on this afternoon. And I'm going to focus just on the mink control today. Next slide. So people actually say, well, what's the big deal about mink and how did they get here and where are they? And when you look at these 2 maps from 1967, where mink distribution in Scotland was very localised and focused around mink farms and escapes from those mink farms or releases. But you can see by 2010, we had mink very, very widespread across mainland Scotland, other than the high mountain areas and that north patch of the Caithness. And when you consider that the last mink farm in Scotland ceased to operate in 1993 and fur farming in Scotland was banned from 2002, you can see that spread is continued after mink farming actually was no longer a factor in the distribution. So these are extending distribution from animals that have escaped or been released for some long time, and therefore it's breeding success and migration that causes that distribution. Next slide. To control American mink, you've got to recognise what a fantastic animal it actually is. It's a voracious and effective predator. It predates on land, it predates aquatically. It impacts on native fauna, particularly water voles and ground nesting birds, who are vulnerable to its ability to be effective on land, but also to access water vole habitats on riparian areas. It's a widespread animal once it's established, but often present at low population density. So you're not going to find very often, lots and lots of animals in the same place at the same time. But that makes them actually quite difficult, one, to detect and thereafter to remove. They are fantastic colonisers. We have 2 migration periods within the calendar year, which I will show you in a little second, where they move quite phenomenal distances to seek breeding territories. And again, I'll show you that in a little second. And they're also resilient to control. So young mink at low density will actually reproduce more effectively and have higher success rates of reproduction than mink at a sort of stable population. So all of these factors make the animals very difficult to control unless you're organised and effective and thoughtful, if you like, as to what you're trying to do. Next slide, please. So mink as migrators, I sort of touched on this a little bit. Mink are seasonally mobile, and at the end of each breeding season, they will try and move to find a new territory for the following breeding season. And the average dispersal distance is about 20 kilometres, so that's quite a long way. But worse than that, or perhaps more impressive than that, is that 20% of the young animals will move greater than 80 kilometres to find a breeding territory. And that map on the right there is from a genetic study that we completed in a previous control project showing the interrelatedness of animals genetically. So that these lines are all connecting animals who have some genetic connection in terms of parentage. So you can see that control in a very local area is less likely to be effective because it's simply just going to be recolonised by animals which are moving around to take up vacant areas and the vacant habitats. I mentioned also that we've got two principal periods when mink migrate, and you can see in the map in the graph in the bottom rather, sort of peak from about now, March, April, May, where animals are moving to find breeding territories for the slightly late in the spring, from May, June, July. And then in late summer again, when the young of the year animals, after breeding, emerge and distribute and disperse to find habitats of their own. So we have two periods where those animals are catchable, basically from now for 2 or 3 months, and again from June, July, August, September. And in between times, when they lie less active in the winter and also are breeding, May and June time, they're very difficult to catch, and actually extending effort to try and catch them is something's not worth it. Next slide, please. So how do you do it? And again, many people will be familiar with this, but there's a couple of different tactics here. We use what we call a mink raft, which is the top left image. And that's essentially just almost like a floating table. And then you can see the tunnel at the top left, and underneath the tunnel is a little clay pad. And the idea is that the mink are so inquisitive that they will enter under the tunnel and leave their little footprints in the clay pad, the picture on the top right. And at that point, we can identify from the footprints that mink are around and in the area. We can then set the trap, again, on top of the raft, so it's floating under the raft and under the tunnel, and hopefully we then catch the mink. So this is important because it means that we can set traps only when we know mink are around and in the area, and particularly when you're working with volunteers, that is important. We can check the mink raft once a week, once a fortnight even, but when you set a trap, you're legally obliged to check it once every day, minimum. So there's a big commitment to set traps different to what we set for the monitoring mode by raft. Next slide, please. We're using live capture traps because sometimes we catch things that we'd rather not. So this is a sort of rogues gallery, if you like, of animals that have meandered into our trap, from polecats to pine martens to young otters to albino ferrets, and of course prime suspect bottom middle, the American mink. So this allows us to, when we do catch these non-target animals, to let them free, but also allows us to keep an eye on what we are actually catching and allow the good guys to get away. Next slide, please. And thinking tactically about where mink are likely to be got and how we might approach this problem, you've got to think habitats, and Rob mentioned habitats earlier on. Mink are not likely to be found at the top of mountains. They're less likely to be found in wetland and peat bogs, but they are very effective on the coastline and agricultural land round about. And when you look at a sort of relief map of Scotland, you can see that the areas of green basically are the non-mountainous areas, and therefore would be tactically where we might want to be covering the ground for mink control. Next slide, please. Also, we know from previous work that we can make a difference to mink abundance when we seek to remove them in this sort of way. So this is from previous work that we've done on Three Rivers on the Dee and the Spey and the Eithean in northeast Scotland from previous mink control work. And we can see that due to detection rates there, the abundance of mink or the frequency of detection of mink halved after 4 years of control. And that allows us to, one, know that we're making a difference, but also two, that we can extrapolate that if we can continue that sort of level of control, we can further depress the number of animals that are around and further, therefore, depress their impact on water voles or ground nesting birds and other important species such as that. Next slide, please. And again, when you look at the detection rates, the two maps that are important here are the middle and the right-hand map. So this is when we had our network of mink rafts working 26 to 2015. And it's essentially a heat map of where we were detecting mink present. So this is footprints on the clay, if you like. And when we look at that distribution 26 to 2015, you can see the dark red areas where a lot of mink activity, a lot of these corresponding with these green areas on the relief map and upriver catchment corridors, and in coastal areas such as Dundonald, you'll see in Wester Ross. But then when we look at that data for 2014 to 15, the final year of that control, we see many, many areas where previously mink were being detected, but were no longer being detected, indicating that we'd been removing quite a lot of the animals and making a depression on the abundance. Next slide, please. And similarly, when you look at mink capture locations over that same period, again, the same two maps are important. The middle one showing everywhere that mink were captured, the darker areas where more mink were captured. And you can see that when we started, mink were, I think the technical term is, all over the shop, and we caught them in lots and lots of different places. But when you look at the final year of control, 2014-15, the mink, the map on your right, we see a much, much more restricted distribution of capture sites, and most of those sites having less animals than previously, or in the previous control from 26. Next slide, please. So coming from that previous work to what we're doing now, so this is the map of our mink raft and trap locations 2018-19, 2020 to be added, but not too different to this profile particularly. And we have some volunteers who are involved in this scheme who operate rafts, and we have some particularly keepers and those professionally engaged with the land who prefer to operate traps straight away, and they can maintain those on a daily basis. So this sort of network, maximum number of traps 245, maximum number of rafts 428. So 650 units potentially out operating across this area of a third of Scotland. And you can see the profile of those distributions on 2018, 19, 20. And as touched upon earlier, the majority of these units are operated by volunteers who are taking time out their day, either once a week or once a fortnight, to keep an eye on a mink raft for us, and or helping to operate a trap when a mink is in the frame. So we're really pleased that we've got that sort of network up. You'll see that a lot of those are clustered around those previous trap capture locations and the prime habitat areas and running up catchments and coastal areas. Next slide, please. And when you look at that network of rafts and traps, here's the capture locations 2018, 2020 for the current project. Total capture locations 172 and total captures 368. So of those potentially 600 odd raft or trap locations, we're actually taking mink from only 172 of those, which means that a significant number, perhaps at least 2/3 of the raft and trap locations operating have never captured a mink. And that's just the way it goes, essentially. But these remain really important to maintain a network of sites across the area to confirm absence of mink, but also detect if and when mink migrate and seek to colonise new areas. So it's important that we maintain that wide network, also recognising that there are most definitely hotspots where we know we are going to catch mink more often than not. Next slide, please. And thinking about, where are the hotspots, where are the locations that we really need to be covering. So this first image is showing where we have caught but one mink. So 94 of those, and rather obviously, we've caught 94 mink from those 94 locations. And you can see the distribution of those again, coastal areas, river catchments, generally lowland or agricultural areas. So quite a wide distribution. When you have a little look at where we're capturing 2 to 4 animals, you can see that network begins to tighten a little bit. A lesser number of sites, 59 locations catching 2 to 4 mink, given 153, 40% of the total. And finally, the real must-cover locations for us are where we're capturing 5 or more mink. And there's only 19 of those sites, but those 19 are capturing a third of the mink, 124 animals from just the sites on that map. So that essentially means that of that network of 600 and plus locations where we have rafts or traps, if we put 19 traps out in those locations on that map, we would still catch a third of the animals. So it's really important that we think smart about where we operate our traps, because if we do that, we can be effective in what we're trying to do and what we're looking to achieve. And thinking about who runs these traps, and I'm sure Vicky will talk a little bit further later on this afternoon about volunteers and how essential they are to what we're doing. We have hundreds of volunteers involved in this scheme, running individual rafts, individual traps, and contributing time every week, every month across the year. And in total giving us over 50,000 volunteer hours from that effort, which is equivalent to 34 staff for 1 year, which is a massive, massive collective contribution of time from lots of different people who are involved for lots and lots of different reasons. And most of the time, these are in units of 15 minutes. So these are lots of hours, tens of thousands of hours from people contributing 15 minutes to half an hour once a week, once a fortnight. So it shows you that, all volunteering does not need to involve, taking days out your life over certain periods of time and being really intense work. We can show them what we're really proud of here is this massive network of people contributing much smaller units of time, but making a really impressive collective effort to what we're trying to achieve. Next slide, please.
Just it's 5 minutes to the break, Callum.
Yeah. So thinking about all that sort of stuff, big scheme, lots of effort, lots of mink, hopefully. What can we learn from practical conservation on this sort of scale? Well, firstly, mink on that scale can be controlled. If you understand the biology and the sources of density dependence, and you understand how the mink operate, then you can make a difference to this animal. You can depress its abundance, and you can reduce its impact. Its dispersal rate makes it essential that you control a large scale. To control mink on small scale, local scale, and without coordination would be ineffective, because mink would certainly just reinvade your prime habitat from outside. So it's really essential that you collaborate and join things together and go on a large scale. Females, as always, in every walk of life, are much more important than the males, but they are restricted generally to a small number of locations in the landscape. And we pretty much know where these productive areas are, and therefore they're the targets that we've must cover in terms of the trapping effort and the control effort. And removing juvenile mink is also important. These juvenile mink are dispersing in the autumn to find new habitats and to perform the breeding population for the following summer. So we've got to get a hold on those as well. Next slide, please. And the practicalities, there's inevitably people and money issues here. So you can do this on this sort of scale, but short-term funding is a problem. Going from project to project in little fits and starts is difficult. Gaps in funding are worse. Losing staff, renaming projects, can all damage the relationship with volunteers who are actually key to delivery, and they actually frankly don't care what the name of the project is, what the logo is, or who's running it. They just want to contribute to something which is going to be effective. So important to think ahead about future funding to try and fill those before the gap arrives. Mink control is absolutely socially acceptable. We have had not but one complaint about issues of animal welfare, because we take those issues very seriously. We run live capture charts, we dispatch humanely by trained people, but actually covering that area of land is a challenge to bring in new volunteers as others come and go, and also to make sure that the big players, the land managing organisations, are seen to be involved. It's important to us that if we want an individual volunteer to be involved in this and commit to contributing, that actually they can see that the major players are partly to this and signed up. And in the main, that happens. Next slide, second last one. And inevitably, I couldn't let it go without reflecting a little bit on what happened last year and is still happening this year. It's affected many of us personally, and it seems a little bit trite to talk about coronavirus in light of a project, but it did impact what we did, but not for long. So we had, at lockdown in March, those sort of numbers of rafts and traps operating, and inevitably in April we shut down. But many volunteers were able to maintain local exercise and help us. And as we got through last year, we accumulated new people come back to the project, could volunteer safely and social isolated way. And by September, we actually had higher levels of rafts and traps and volunteer effort than we had actually in March at lockdown. So coronavirus was undoubtedly disruptive, but we were able to work carefully and safely rebuild and bring things back on an even keel. So hopefully that's in a whistle-stop tour in a sort of technically challenged way, and give you a little run through what we've tried to do and are doing. If anyone would like to volunteer with the project, we would love to hear from you. cc@nature.scot is the email address to get us on, and we will sort you out. Control a Mink can work, it does work, but it needs a collaborative effort, and it needs people all working together. Thank you very much. I'm done.